Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Mr. Merrigan's Moments in History, U.S. History Edition. Today we're going to start our journey through World War II. Today we're going to get into the rise of dictators in Europe and certainly make our way towards the doorstep of the actual fighting for World War II. But we're going to start with our learning objective for today. We're going to be able to identify how dictators essentially acquired and expanded their power in Europe in the 1930s. Certainly, again, one of the more iconic dictators of this time period, of course, would be Germany's Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler, along with certainly other ruthless dictators, and when we use this word today, what we're referring to is a leader who rules with total authority, often in a cruel and often also very brutal in how they rule their people. And typically in this sort of situation, they're taking advantage of people's feelings. So let's use Germany as an example. So the fear, certainly, with Germany going through an economic depression, there's a fear of food running out, there's a fear of losing your job, there's a fear for your future, there's a fear for, if you've got children, their future. He also certainly, in the Nazi Party as a whole, really preys on the anger of the German people. And that's an anger towards Europe, having to pay reparations for being in the situation that they are, and the suffering that they've been feeling. Hyperinflation has devastated the German people. You've got very high unemployment, and things overall feel very bleak for the German people. And again, they often rise to power in times where there is a depressed economic time period. And that's certainly true for most of Europe, especially in the years after World War I. You're going to see something similar in Italy. You're going to see Benito Mussolini usher in fascism, and he's going to help make that popular. He's going to force Italy's king to name him as the leader of the government. Now, fascism is certainly is a form of government that we should be aware of as we head into World War II. But it's a political system. It's a type of government that is headed by a dictator and typically calls for extreme nationalism, extreme loyalty to one's nation, often calls for racism, and has little to no tolerance, usually no tolerance, for opposition. So there's no opposition parties, there's no freedom of speech, there's no freedom of the press. It is purely to support the dictator. And Mussolini's going to end all the democratic rule, and from there he's going to build up the military, again with the idea that war is coming, or to militarily take things over. Adolf Hitler, again, he's going to become the leader of the Nationalist Socialist Party, which again is going to be more commonly known as the Nazi Party. And this party looks at the issues that Germany is facing, and they blame the Jewish people for those problems in Germany. This is certainly a part of what we would call Adolf Hitler's anti-Semitism. This is a hostility, typically also a discrimination against Jewish people. And this is going to lead to, again, unspeakable horrors. Certainly, we will get more into the Holocaust, and we'll spend some time listening to people in class. And I'll tell you a little bit more about some of the camps. More to come on that later, though. Hitler also is going to end democracy in Germany, and he's going to establish what we would call a totalitarian state. This is a political system, again, in which the government suppresses all opposition. There's no freedom of speech, there's no freedom of press, there's no speaking out against the government, even privately, and it controls most aspects of people's lives. You're also going to see fascism grow in Japan, but Japanese leaders are also looking to expand beyond their islands. And so there's this feeling there's just not enough resources and enough land. And so you see Japan is going to invade the mineral-rich area of Manchuria, which is located right in here. And this is a region, again, in northern China. This takes place in 1931. You're going to see these invasions continue throughout the Pacific as we march towards World War II in the Pacific. So in 1940, officially, Japan joins Germany and Italy as part of the Axis Alliance. Now you're also going to see, after Vladimir Lenin's death, that Joseph Stalin is going to rise to power in the Soviet Union in the late 1920s. When Lenin was dying, he said at all costs to avoid having Stalin take power. Unfortunately, nobody was able to. And when Stalin comes to power, he uses force to obtain obedience through his people. He's also going to use what are called the gulags as a way of punishing people who he saw as opposition or people who wouldn't bend the knee. So let's give ourselves a little bit of a timeline on the rise of Nazism as we get into Germany. And let's start things off in 1918. So Germany is going to lose the war. They're going to be forced to pay these reparations. And you're going to see Germany suffer in that time period afterwards. So in 1921, Hitler's going to become the leader of the Nazi Party. And again, they're preying on those fears, that suffering, that anger that Germans are feeling towards the rest of Europe. And again, that fear about that economic depression that they find themselves in. So in 1923, you're going to see an attempt by the Nazis to try to seize power in Munich. It's going to fail miserably. It's going to lead to the arrest of several people, including Adolf Hitler. And while Hitler is in prison, in 1925, he writes his book Mein Kampf, which is German for My Struggle, going to essentially outline his views on how to fix Germany. And he's going to use a lot of what he wrote in that book to guide his actions when he becomes chancellor. So in 1929, for the United States, the Great Depression begins. Again, the Depression certainly was being felt already in many parts of Europe. In 1930, you're going to start to see many Nazis are going to be elected to the German parliament, which is kind of like Germany's Congress or our legislative branch. And in 1933, Hitler is going to be named chancellor or the head of the government. So you see kind of through that timeline a little bit of that process in rising to power. So back in the United States, Congress is going to pass the Neutrality Acts, again, not choosing any sides in Europe, and it's going to ban weapon sales and loans to nations that are at war. All right, Germany on the march. So this is where we're going to kind of shift gears. We're going to see how actions, but also inactions, lay the groundwork for the war beginning. And that's kind of where we're going to start today. But we're going to be able to explain why other European countries stood by or chose not to take a more active approach as Germany began to expand its territory. So let's kind of get our bearings here. So, of course, we've got Germany with its borders after we would have seen after World War I. We've got Austria here. We've got the Rhineland. Again, this was an area that was demilitarized. And this was done, of course, after the invasion of Belgium and France in World War I. And then you've got the Sudetenland area here bordering with Czechoslovakia. And, of course, Czechoslovakia here and Poland located here. Those areas are going to be very important to our discussion here as we move forward. So, again, those will be very important as we move forward here in our discussions. So, again, those areas will be very important in the discussion as we move forward. So, in March of 1936, Hitler is going to order German troops to enter into the Rhineland. So, that's our area right here where number 1 is. Again, this was the area that had become demilitarized after World War I on account of the invasion of Belgium and France during the First World War. Hitler also isn't going to insist that Austria be unified, and again, that's a term that means to be joined together with Germany, and essentially is going to send troops in March of 1938 to acquire that land. That, of course, is where the number 2 is. So again, what we've seen already is 2 steps in Germany adding to its territory here, and has entered, in the case of Austria, into a sovereign nation. And so you're going to see a very reluctant nation being forced into accepting Nazi rule. Again, it's not what they chose. Hitler then is declared Germany had the right to enter into the German-speaking Switzerland, and also later on into Czechoslovakia. Now, as this is going on, Britain and France have this decision to make. They can either get actively involved in a military conflict and risk starting a world war over these actions, or they can try to accept the demands of the Germans and hope that by giving a little bit, they can avoid a larger war. So they're going to practice what we call appeasement, which again is this idea that you're accepting demands, typically not something that you'd want, in order to avoid a conflict. And in this case, potentially another world war. So they enter into the Munich Conference. And again, British and French leaders are again going to accept that Switzerland will be given to Germany, and in exchange, Hitler is going to give this pledge that he's not going to expand any further into Europe, especially east. Their primary concerns are Czechoslovakia and Poland. And they're going to take Hitler at his word, but they also have this fear that it won't be enough. And of course, we know from hindsight that it won't be, that Hitler always wanted more. And so they meet at the Munich Conference, again, with the hope of avoiding a world war. And again, you're looking at Prime Minister Chamberlain here in the center. So we head into March of 1939, and despite his pledge, Hitler is going to invade the rest of Czechoslovakia. Again, located here, and essentially breaking his promise or breaking his pledge, and certainly, again, is inching Europe closer and closer to war. However, in a move that probably demonstrates that Hitler has learned a little bit from history, because remember, Hitler fought in World War I. In fact, his life was spared by an Allied soldier who could have killed Hitler in a particular event. And what he remembers is the difficulty in fighting a two-front war. So before his attempts at continuing to expand in the case of invading Poland, Hitler is going to sign a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. It's going to become known as the Soviet-German Non-Aggression Pact. And he's going to do that in August of 1939, basically a month before he decides to invade Poland, September 1st, 1939. And again, Hitler's trying to avoid a two-front war here. He doesn't want to end up fighting against the Soviet Union in the east and against Britain and France in the west. So he's trying to learn from those mistakes before, again, moving on to invade Poland. All right, that is going to wrap up kind of this first section. Certainly highly encourage you to check out this review, just as a way to kind of make sure that you are keeping up with kind of some of the big ideas that we talked about, and of course knowing some of those key people. So I want to thank everybody for listening. Hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll continue our journey through World War II. But we'll see you then on the next edition of Mr. American's Moments in History.